Friends, unfortunately, religious freedom is worsening across the globe for all religions. For years, I helped represent Open Doors USA in Washington, D.C. It's a persecuted church ministry. We worked with Congress to strengthen America's work internationally, and I spent time in Geneva at the United Nations Human Rights Council and in New York City at the UN, working with countries to embrace religious freedom for all people. Healthy countries, healthy civil societies, embrace religious freedom. To help us understand the threats to religious freedom facing the world, Colorado Christian University is proud to welcome Dr. Daniel Mark, chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Daniel Mark is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University, where he has taught since 2013. He teaches political theory, philosophy of law, American political thought, and politics and religion. You know, all the easy things. At Villanova, he is a faculty associate of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good. He holds the rank of battalion professor in Villanova's Navy Reserve Officers Training Corps Unit. He is also on the steering committee for the Villanova Political Theology Project and on the graduate committee of the Department of Political Science. He has served as the faculty advisor to the mock trial team and to the men's club lacrosse team, and as a mentor to the university's Faith and Learning Scholars Program. For the 2017-2018 academic year, Dr. Mark is on leave from Villanova University and is a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, under the sponsorship of the Tocqueville Program for the Inquiry into Religion and Public Life, as well as the Notre Dame Institute for Advanced Study, the program on church, state, and society, and the Centers for Ethics and Culture. In the 2015-2016 academic year, he was on sabbatical as a visiting fellow in the Department of Politics at Princeton University under the sponsorship of the department's James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. Dr. Mark is a fellow at the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, and works with the Tikva Fund in New York. He is an affiliate scholar of the James Wilson Institute on Natural Rights and the American Founding in Washington, D.C., and he has taught at the Strauss Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University. Dr. Mark is also a member of the Advisory Council at Cana Vox. He has served as an assistant editor of the Journal Interpretation and is a contributor to the Arc of the Universe blog. Dr. Mark speaks frequently for a wide variety of different groups, including the Acton Institute at West Point, the American Enterprise Institute, the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, the Love and Fidelity Network, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, Opus Dei, and many others. He spoke recently at the World Meeting of Families, a triennial event organized by the Catholic Church, which drew 20,000 participants to Philadelphia. In addition to speaking here at CCU before, he's spoken at Arizona University, Baylor University, BYU, and a lot of other groups, universities I'm not going to list all. In addition to his academic writings, Dr. Mark has published on topics related to international religious freedom in U.S. News and World Report, Investors Business Daily, Foreign Affairs, The Hill, and has appeared on CNN, Al Jazeera, CBS, KNUS here in Denver, and Relevant Radio. He holds his BA and magna cum laude, MA, PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He wrote his dissertation under the direction of Professor Robert P. George, one of our very favorites here, on the subject of authority and legal obligation. There, he participated in the program in law and public affairs and the Penn-Princeton Bioethics Forum. Dr. Mark was appointed to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom on May 9th by then Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and reappointed on May 16th by the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, for a two-year term expiring this May. Friends, we are so grateful to have such a distinguished scholar with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Daniel Mark.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for the kind, generous, long introduction. I hope the rest isn't a letdown after this. I was not informed that we were competing on interfaith jokes coming up here, so I don't have any good ones for you, but I'm not that funny anyway, so thank you for setting the bar really low on humor tonight. Thank you also to the young women who did the prayer and the pledge. I do want to see the notes after, just on the punctuation of thank you very much, Dr. Mark. We love you, so on and so forth. I think there was the love you that was for me or for him. Anyway, it was good. I appreciate it. And it's great to be here. Thank you so much to President Sweeting. It's an honor to be with you, and I'm very grateful to you and to Vice President Hunt for the invitation and for the very fine hospitality. Thanks also to C-SPAN for being here, and to the live broadcast so that my mom can watch this at home. As you heard, I'm Daniel Mark. I'm a professor at Villanova, visiting professor at Notre Dame, and chairman, relevant for tonight, chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Just so we're clear, I do want to mention that tonight I'm speaking here only for myself and not representing the institutions with which I'm affiliated, so I can express my own views freely. We're on the record here with the camera, so I'll have to behave myself a little bit more than I usually like to, but usually I lose control during the Q&A anyway, so we'll do what we can, and I will try to leave a lot of time for the Q&A as well. And I know that for me, the most enjoyable part is the engagement with the audience after the talk. And I would be happy, though I'm speaking for myself, to take questions on anything you want, including USCIF, which is what we call the commission for short. 150 years ago this June, the Edgardo Mortara case shocked the world. Edgardo Mortara, a 6-year-old Jewish boy in Italy, was taken from his family by the papal authorities and raised as a Catholic under the supervision of the Pope. This was done under the law in Bologna, then part of the Papal States, after it was discovered that 5 years earlier, the boy's Catholic nanny had secretly baptized the then 1-year-old child when he fell ill, and she feared he was going to die. The law required that this quote-unquote Catholic child receive a Catholic education. This story, a major sensation at the time that had vast repercussions, has garnered added attention lately because of the coverage in First Things, long the country's premier journal of religion and public life, and I do commend the journal to you, and its article on a recent publication of an English edition of Mortara's memoirs. The article in First Things on this new translation got so much attention because the article's author appeared to be justifying the abduction of the boy by the Pope and his police. Or if justifying is too strong of a word, I'll say explaining sympathetically. Needless to say, this brought some heat on First Thing's editor, who was criticized for publishing the piece. It's not my plan to discuss the Mortara case itself, or the questionable article inspired by the memoir, or even the wisdom of publishing such a piece in First Things. But I do want to take, as my starting point for this lecture, the opening line of the editor's response to the criticism of his decision to print the article. Quote, "The Edgardo Mortara episode is a stain on the Catholic Church. Whatever one thinks about the efficacy of baptism, forcibly separating a child from his parents is a grievous act. And even if one can construct a theoretical rationale for doing so, as Romanus Cesario, the author of the article, does, it was wildly imprudent of Pius IX to take Edgardo from his parents, given the scandal it brought upon the Catholic Church, a scandal that continues to this day," unquote. And to be clear, I'm not here as a Jew speaking to Protestants to criticize Catholics. That's not where this is going. In considering these words, setting aside politics and motivations and so forth, what we have before us is a fundamental issue concerning religious freedom. we have before us the underlying question of whether people have the right to choose and live their faith free from interference by the government, or whether the limits of religious freedom are determined solely by judgment of prudence, such as whether encroachments on religious freedom will detract from a state's international standing. In other words, we have the question of whether people have a right to religious freedom in principle or only in practice when it suits the state. Skipping for a moment to the punchline, let me say that I take the first view, namely that religious freedom is a God-given, inalienable right. To be sure, this does not mean that the right to religious freedom has no limits. Like with other rights, reasonable limits can and do exist, but the nature and scope of those limits, too, will have to be the subject of another talk. Here, instead, I'd like to make the case for why it is more important than ever to articulate the principled case for religious freedom. I'll begin by describing a variety of ways in which religious freedom is threatened, from the right, from the left, and around the globe, ways that together combine to create a landscape that in our time that is deeply worrisome. From there, I will suggest a way forward in defending religious freedom. Given the battles over the scope of the First Amendment in this country, I am sure that many of you are eager to hear about religious freedom in the West. But before that, I want to address religious freedom outside the West, where in so many places, religious freedom is imperiled. The peril comes from what I'll call the totalitarian threat. This totalitarian threat has two prongs, one religious and one secular. We find religious totalitarianism in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia, though recent developments in Saudi Arabia suggest that that country may be headed in a new direction. Stay tuned, we'll see. What's critical to remember about those places is that the problem isn't just religious freedom for minorities, it's religious freedom for everyone. Even if an individual or a group, or even the majority of the country, happens to adhere to the state-enforced version of religion, those people do not possess religious freedom. None of them is free to dissent, or change, or deny. None of them is free to adhere to a different version of the government-backed sect. Things may be worse for religious minorities, but the theocratic ways of these countries deprive the entire population, not just minorities, of religious freedom. Such violations of religious freedom are not new, of course, but in many ways the threat is growing. ISIS is the epitome, and thus far the peak, of such extremism. The caliphate stands for religious totalitarianism. Thank God, ISIS has been beaten back in some places, but it lives on in many others, and the ideology is not going away anytime soon. On the contrary, as ISIS has receded in that part of the world, Iran and its oppressive ways have spread noticeably into Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other places. In May, I traveled to Pakistan. Despite the heavy influence of the military, I would not classify Pakistan as totalitarian, yet the culture in that country has regressed significantly. Very shortly before my visit, a Muslim university student named Mishal Khan was lynched following an accusation of blasphemy. Pakistan, sadly, is a world leader, maybe the world leader, in prosecutions, convictions, and imprisonments for blasphemy, with some even on death row. But perhaps worse is the horrific vigilante violence perpetrated against the accused in so many cases. This violence is fostered by a climate of impunity that too often sees accusers and attackers suffer no penalties. The case I mentioned of the university student was particularly notable because it exploded the narrative in Pakistan that blasphemy accusations and the accompanying vigilante attacks affect mainly poor and illiterate religious minorities, such as the dispute between farmhands that landed the innocent Christian woman Asya Bibi in prison, even on death row, on spurious charges of apostasy. The victim in the university case was a young, educated, well-to-do Muslim man, murdered by his fellow students in the name of a toxic, totalitarian ideology that brooks no deviations and no dissenters. I will say more about blasphemy laws, but let me add another word about Pakistan first. One group targeted for egregious discrimination in Pakistan is the Ahmadis, a sect that other Muslims consider to be heretical. They're like, and you'll forgive me if this is not a good comparison, they're like the Muslim Mormons, followers of a latter-day 19th century prophet at odds with the more traditional adherents of their faith. Ahmadis are despised throughout the Muslim world, but in Pakistan, they are singled out even in the country's constitution for special official discrimination. For instance, in order to vote, Ahmadis must renounce their beliefs. They are not allowed to call themselves Muslims, though they believe themselves to be, and they are not allowed to call their houses of worship mosques. Recently, the government proposed a very modest change to the wording of the law that would not guarantee, but at least might open the door to Ahmadis voting freely. In reaction to this tiny step, protesters brought the capital city of Islamabad to a standstill, a situation the government was only able to diffuse and resolve by yielding to the demands that the change in the law be withdrawn and the law minister who proposed it resign. The blasphemy laws in Pakistan are an enormous problem, but I suspect you'll be surprised to learn the extent of blasphemy regulations around the world. In 2016, USCIF released a report that constituted a first ever attempt, as far as we know, to catalog and analyze all the blasphemy laws in the world. I encourage you to check it out on our website, www.uscirf.gov. Guess how many countries in the world have blasphemy laws? Almost 70. A third of the countries in the world. Surprised? Well, you'll be even more surprised when you learn which countries have them. In addition to the usual suspects, and there are plenty of usual suspects, the list includes, I'll pause for dramatic effect, Austria, Brazil, Canada, Cyprus, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Italy, New Zealand, Spain, and Switzerland, to name a few. To be sure, blasphemy laws in these countries are often not enforced or are enforced minimally, yet we on the Commission believe that all countries should repeal their blasphemy laws, as Denmark and Malta have recently, and good for them. Why is this so important? Well, for one thing, we think it will set a good example and put pressure on countries in which blasphemy laws are enforced more vigorously, often with brutal consequences. But at the heart of the matter, it's because of the principle that's at stake. Religious freedom, as enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, entails that, quote, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes the freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community, with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance, unquote. For that right to be secure, the right to believe and to change one's beliefs, people must be free to deviate or dissent from the local orthodoxy. They must be allowed to reject the local gods and to call their own gods by whatever name they see fit. Blasphemy laws, enforced or not, Canada or Pakistan, establish that in principle, the government can regulate what you believe. And I say believe because true belief is so often inseparable from the expression of that belief in one form or another. Blasphemy laws establish that one's religious freedom isn't a right in the proper sense, but an entitlement or privilege subject to judgments of prudence by the state. Thus, religious totalitarianism ultimately aims to control the entire person, even down to one's thoughts. And this much it certainly shares with its secular counterpart. This brings us to the other major threat to religious freedom abroad, secular totalitarianism. In some cases, the totalitarianism is truly ideologically secular. While religious totalitarianism fears false gods, secular totalitarianism fears the true God. This is the case, for example, in China, where the communist state is officially atheist. For Chinese officials, and the same goes for other communist dictatorships, religion is a threat because it offers a source of authority and allegiance outside the ruling party. So they are very keen to stamp out religion wherever it flourishes free from government control. If you followed the news lately, China can tolerate the state-appointed bishops, but not the underground ones. One group that is severely oppressed in China is the Uyghur Muslims. Lately, the government has stepped up its suppression of their practice of Islam with far-reaching measures, including prohibitions on beards that are too long, on fasting during Ramadan, and even on giving children certain Muslim names. The Uyghurs are mostly found in Western China, and the government perpetrates these violations, claiming separatist agitation among the Uyghurs. Although Islamist extremism is a real threat around the world, the Chinese government does not merit the benefit of the doubt when it comes to religious freedom in particular, or human rights in general. As far as we can tell, the majority of Uyghur Muslims are peaceful, and their treatment is plainly unjust. I raise the issue of the Uyghur Muslims in China because it points to a wider phenomenon of secular governments, mostly authoritarian, repressing religion in the name of security. This is particularly true in the Central Asian states of the former Soviet Union, affectionately known as the Stans, but including Azerbaijan, which doesn't end in Stan. Once again, I concede that the worldwide threat of Islamic extremism is real. Yet too often, legitimate security concerns are used as a pretext for excessive restrictions on religious freedom. In these countries, through elaborate systems of registration and approvals, very Soviet style, the governments regulate and monitor all religious activity. Muslims, who make up the vast majority of these countries, often secular Muslim countries, as well as Christians and other small groups, suffer unjustly in the name of national security. Here, the government is not so much seeking to impose an ideology as it does in a theocracy, yet it hopes to bolster the state's unrivaled authoritativeness by preserving the society's irreligious character. In some ways, admittedly, this state-centered vision becomes a stand-in for religion itself, North Korea being the most radical and most ridiculous example. Either way, the end result is that religious and secular totalitarianism take religious freedom as their enemy. From that perspective, we in the West have it pretty good. Serving on USCIF, which monitors and reports on the worst religious freedom situations in the world, I am acutely aware of how our challenges at home pale in comparison to what goes on abroad. But the lesson from this is not what you think. It's not that we should feel so good as to become complacent or quiescent about our present circumstances. On the contrary, the painful international scene should be an ever-present reminder to us of how rare, how precious, and how vulnerable religious freedom is, and how vigilant we must be in defending it. We're not inherently better or more deserving of religious freedom than anyone else in the world, and we should not take our good fortune for granted. Rather, we must work hard. And here is the key: we must work hard to preserve the cultural and then the political and legal conditions that make religious freedom possible. In short, we should not make either mistake. We should not forget our good fortune and lose perspective about how good we have it, and we do. Nor should we feel so pleased as to take our good fortune for granted. Moreover, Developments in our own civilization already show us how the erosion of this sacred right can occur. So let me talk about domestic challenges to religious freedom from the right and the left. To ward off any misunderstanding, I hasten to add that I am not hung up on the labels right and left, but those terms are useful shorthand that everybody understands, so I'll proceed with them. I'm going to start with the challenge from the left, because I think it's more obvious and better known. In the big picture, there is some good news. Important religious liberty cases have come up 9-0 in the Supreme Court, though admittedly, many of the cases on the most sensitive social issues have been 5-4. Other political and legal trends are very worrying, such as the failure of the original Religious Freedom Restoration Act in my temporary home state of Indiana and similar problems elsewhere, not to mention many actions by the Obama administration. More worrying still are the sociological trends. It is a cliche by now, so perhaps you know it, that the fastest growing religious group in America is the nuns. Correct. Not religious sisters in habits, but those who check none, N-O-N-E, on surveys of religious affiliation. That is worrying for plenty of reasons. But for our purposes tonight, my concern about this trend is that people who do not value religious freedom, religion, will not value religious freedom. People who do not value religion will not value religious freedom. When some accuse religious freedom of being nothing more than camouflage for bigotry, which they often do, we must do more than simply assert that we have the right under the First Amendment to be bigots. We must make the affirmative case for the value of religion and therefore of religious freedom. Otherwise, we will soon see legislatures, courts, and agencies redefining the right of religious freedom and narrowing the scope of its protection. If you doubt this, look at what's happening with guns. Many on the left obviously don't think gun rights should exist in the first place. And they're entitled to that belief, of course. I don't mean to take a side in the debate, but they are stuck with the inconvenient fact that gun rights are protected by the Second Amendment in the Constitution. So their project involves seeing how far gun rights can be limited within that framework if the Second Amendment cannot be repealed altogether. As a thought experiment, imagine if people no longer valued the press. How long would freedom of the press remain protected given all the mischief the press causes, from reporting on worthless celebrity gossip to undermining national security by revealing classified information? It would be easy to roll back the free press in the name of combating these ills. So too with religious freedom. If Americans do not appreciate the importance of religious freedom, then religious freedom will fall to claims of discrimination. As I alluded to a moment ago, the main challenges to religious freedom in the West today stem from identity politics, and especially identity politics pertaining to sex. Declining adherence to traditional faiths further enables this assault on religious freedom. But there is something deeper at play and at stake here. Underlying the identity politics of sex, and therefore the current attacks on religious freedom as discrimination, is a postmodern, better called hypermodern, denial of human nature that amounts to a rejection of all reason and all authority. I better repeat that. Underlying the identity politics of sex, and therefore the current attacks on religious freedom as discrimination, is a denial of human nature that amounts to a rejection of reason and authority. This movement, in essence, rejects anything that stands in the way of radical personal autonomy, not only to choose unrestrained what we do, but even what we are. Although the point of this destructive ideology in its purpose and its underlying aim may not be an attack on the church is, for all intents and purposes, the main enemy, because it is the standard bearer of and chief witness to everything the other side wishes to deny. In fairness, All the major religions, my own included, major world religions, stand in the way of and ultimately against the idea that life's deepest meaning and purpose are found in shaping ourselves and our world according to our own will. It's just that in our country, our blessed country, the church has the good fortune of being the lead representative on our side. One central consequence of this denial of human nature is that it leads ineluctably to a denial of human rights. Without a firm view of human nature, we cannot construct a coherent account of human rights. I'm aware, of course, that the people I have in mind here claim all sorts of things in the name of human rights. But the new menu of human rights is selective, subjective, and finally indefensible. Indeed, the contradiction of inventing some new rights while disparaging others proves the precise point I wish to make, that the left has sufficiently confused the concept of rights as to make it useless. The inconsistency is built into their thinking because without reason and nature, there's no longer a sound philosophical basis for discovering what is a right and what isn't. Having abandoned the proper grounds for human rights in order to make room for their ever-expanding list of demands, they have left the concept of rights stretched so thin, or so watered down, if you prefer that metaphor, that the very idea is endangered. So it's not just that religious freedom is under attack because traditional beliefs are a threat to radical autonomy, but the notion of rights itself is under attack, and necessarily so by the logic of the thing, if those ends are to be pursued, those other ends. So that's the view looking to the left. Now on to the right. Tonight I want to discuss two separate strands on the right, and I want to be very clear that I'm distinguishing them. I'm not lumping them together. The first strand that I have in mind is the alt-right, a term which lately seems to have disappeared from our national vocabulary almost as suddenly as it appeared. Nevertheless, the phenomenon bears addressing, if briefly. In a way, the alt-right is like those I've described on the left in that it represents another kind of identity politics and rejects the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings captured so memorably in the Declaration of Independence. Insofar as the alt-right is on the right at all, it is right-wing in a way that is mostly alien to American conservatism, thank God. The latter, American conservatism, being a version of classical liberalism. This fundamental divide between the alt-right's identity politics of race and nation on one hand and classical liberalism on the other hand is partly why I think the antagonism between the Republican Party's uneasiest of bedfellows is so bitter. Yet there is another challenge to classical liberalism from the right, and it is a significant one. In the realm of ideas, these critics are much more consequential than the alt-right, and they may have long-term political sway because they dwell among the elite opinion makers in our country. And let me note that this includes some people I like and respect very much, even as we disagree. I mentioned earlier that we need to safeguard the cultural and then the political and legal conditions that make religious freedom possible. As I see it, those conditions arose from the confluence of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian ideas and civilizations. Yet even among those who acknowledge the Christian roots of the American system specifically, some argue that the fusion of Christianity and Enlightenment thinking drew too much on the latter. Put crudely, that America is too much John Locke. And for the students in the room, I trust you know who John Locke is. For these critics, the problem with classical liberalism, follow me here, the problem with classical liberalism isn't that we're doing the American experiment wrong, that we've lost our way and forgotten the vision of the founders, but that the American experiment is fatally flawed and bound to fail. They reject classical liberalism in principle, and especially its emphasis on individual rights. I accept that the individualist tendencies of classical liberalism need to be balanced with other values, such as community and authority, but not because classical liberalism is itself poison. Indeed, I think all conservatives agree that individual rights are not enough, but the question is whether they are actually the problem. Though it would be overstating things to say that these thinkers constitute a group or a school of thought, the net result of their work is that we have today a constellation of figures on the right who, in different ways and for different reasons, variously question political liberty, economic liberty, and religious liberty. One of the most famous critics on the right of our current state of affairs is the author and blogger Rod Dreher. Many of you have probably heard of his book, The Benedict Option. First, a disclaimer. I know Rod Dreher, and I know his book, and he is not arguing for many of the things that have come to be associated with the phrase, the Benedict Option, which has taken on a life of its own. But because of what it has come to mean for so many, it is a handy term. In defining the Benedict Option, Dreher sometimes uses the phrase strategic retreat, which is more modest. But for others, the Benedict Option means heading to the hills or circling the wagons. Whatever Dreher himself means, those others are the folks I'm concerned with. For those who see the ills of our society and accept that some reaction is necessary, which includes me, and probably a lot of people at this university and affiliated with it, the debate over what to do really matters and is quite revealing. The question for Benedict Option advocates of all stripes is, what exactly do you intend in your retreat from American society? Is the plan to escape classical liberalism altogether, or to batten down the hatches and ride out the storm until classical liberalism in America come back to its senses? Do they want their Benedict Option communities to be oases of classical liberalism in a world gone mad? Or will their communities be refuges from classical liberalism? I joked with Dreher that his book ought to have been titled, Live Like Orthodox Jews. But there's an important division between modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. Modern Orthodox Jews, like myself, cluster in small, walkable neighborhoods, insist on sending their children to Jewish schools, emphasize regular prayer, all things Dreher recommends. Ultra-Orthodox Jews do all that and more, but they do it in the context, quite often, of an in-principle rejection of Western culture and values. Again, leaving aside what Dreher himself wants, let's ask what the related critics of classical liberalism envision. Is their goal to build a newer, better, though likely smaller Christendom? Or is the goal to create just enough space to rebuild a Christian culture within a classical liberal order? Do they wish to reground individual rights on a true and sound basis? Or do they want to instrumentalize, minimize, and relativize individual rights, which they see as inimical to the common good in the long run? Do they believe in political, economic, and religious liberty, not just in prudence, but in principle? Do they believe it was wrong for the Pope to kidnap Edgardo Mortara? Or just poor judgment about the consequences? In the end, do they see classical liberalism and Christianity as compatible or incompatible? Let me repeat my earlier concession. The critics may say that I am naive about classical liberalism, but if so, my naivete only goes so far. I am not here to contend that religious freedom and individual rights are enough on their own. That was not the founders' view, and it's not mine. As John Adams said, liberty can no more exist without virtue and independence than the body can live and move without a soul. When I talk about preserving the conditions that nourish the best features of the American order, I recognize that liberty alone is insufficient. Virtue, which requires religion, is also necessary. To be sure, classical liberals and the critics acknowledge that virtue and religion are necessary for a flourishing society. But the critics contend that classical liberalism itself necessarily, inevitably, undermines the very conditions that make its own existence possible. In other words, that classical liberalism is cannibalistic. They argue, or at least imply, that individual rights rot a free society from the inside. If they're right, then it is futile to try to foster a Christian culture within a classically liberal order for the long term. This is why we hear more and more talk today about integralism, about unseparating church and state, about Christian monarchists. At risk of oversimplifying, I will say that those conversations don't sound like they're about restoring a Christian culture, but about restoring Christendom. So let me counter one Catholic intellectual movement with another. Not only Catholic intellectual movements, of course, but largely populated by such folks. Let me counter it with another, namely the movement that culminated in the Second Vatican Council, and specifically the papal encyclical on religious freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. The critics are correct to worry about rights when rights come to mean the freedom to do whatever you feel like doing. But the best versions of classical liberalism have never accepted that. The correct view is embodied in the old distinction in our language that I always like to teach my students between liberty and license. License is the freedom to do what you want. Liberty is the freedom to pursue the good. What is so important about Dignitatis Humanae is that it points us to a proper understanding of rights by grounding the right of religious freedom in the good of religion. Rights are justified in virtue of the goods they allow us to pursue. That is, we cannot understand what rights are and which rights are until we understand what rights are for. To recover a proper account of rights, we must start with a proper account of goods and the good. Once we know what is truly good for our nature, what is truly part of human flourishing, then we can know which rights are real and which aren't. Free speech, for example, is essential to the good of truth because true knowledge must be held in light of all available evidence and arguments. And religious freedom is essential to the good of religion because in order to be genuine, it must be freely chosen. The rights protect the goods. Here is a line from the opening section of Dignitatis Humanae. Religious freedom, in turn, which men demand as necessary to fulfill their duty to worship God, has to do with immunity from coercion in civil society. Therefore, it leaves untouched traditional Catholic doctrine, and I think here we could say broadly Christian doctrine, on the moral duty of men and societies toward the true religion and toward the one church of Christ. Underpinning the right is a good, even a duty here, toward which the right points and which it safeguards. Now let us turn back to international religious freedom for a moment. In many places, as you can imagine, we are not asking whether religious freedom will be preserved, but whether it will emerge. And it will matter in these places, not just whether the idea of individual rights gain hold, but what notion of individual rights. Insofar as liberalism does spread outside the West, and it may not, but insofar as it does, will it be the kind that cherishes and nurtures religious freedom, or will it be the kind that despises and dismisses it? What Islam, for example, needs, I think, is a reformation, small r, in the spirit of Dignitatis Humanae. The Caliphate has no room for individual rights, and no version of faithful Islam will want to make room for a form of liberalism that shreds religion, nor should it. In contrast to the worst excesses of radical individualism today, Dignitatis Humanae makes it possible to explain why religious freedom is good, because it starts with why religion is good. This is the kind of foundation that rights need. Religious freedom today is caught between opponents on the left and the right. On the left, some who fight in the name of individual rights distort and weaken the concept so much as to make it meaningless and indefensible. Sometimes they explicitly attack religious freedom head-on in the name of more legitimate or more pressing so-called rights. On the right, witnessing the havoc in our society wreaked in the name of liberty, some have concluded that liberty is the problem. In these circumstances, we need to discover or recover a proper account of rights. That begins with a proper grasp of the good of religion, and finally, all the goods that constitute human flourishing. Thank you.
All right. That was very well done. Thank you so much. We're gonna, we now have time for some questions back here. Raise your hand. Justin's got one over here as well, so raise your hand if you have a question. Dr. Watson.
I think I'm liberated from the podium now, having done my duty, so I'm going to get comfortable with the crowd here, if that's all right. They told me that was okay before, yeah.
I guess I'd like to ask how safe Fethullah Gulen is in Pennsylvania. I know that Flynn was actually working on trying to get him extradited back to Erdogan, but Erdogan has imprisoned all of his movement, tens of thousands of Gulenists, and I'm just worried about their safety and whether we're going to mend fences with Erdogan by giving up his rival, and give it back to him.
Yes, thank you. This is a very big question about the very egregious situation in Turkey right now. As you know, we find ourselves in the terrible position of essentially having a NATO partner who is no longer an ally of our country. Pretty bad situation. One of the things that's happened, and I hope people know about this, if you don't, telling you about this alone makes my visit worthwhile. There is an American pastor named Pastor Andrew Brunson who's being held in prison in Turkey. He hasn't been tried, he hasn't been sentenced, or he's detained in Turkey. We passed recently the 1-year anniversary of his detention. He's a man who worked peacefully for decades with a small congregation in Turkey, not a troublemaker, not anything. And then in the wake of this crazy failed attempted coup or alleged attempted coup or whatever it is that happened in Turkey, he found himself in jail along with, as you said to me before the lecture correctly, tens of thousands of Gulen supporters and so on. Well, why is Pastor Brunson in jail? Well, at one point, they kind of deny this now. Erdogan said, well, you have a pastor and we have a pastor. He wants Gulen sent back from Turkey, from the United States to Turkey. I mean, Gulen's just living innocently and peacefully in the United States. I don't think our country is going to send him back because of this blackmail. That's my view. I mean, of course, that would be the position I would take if you asked me personally, that we couldn't give in to that kind of blackmail. I think it would probably, in the don't negotiate with terrorists kind of mode would just endanger further Americans. But it's really bad. On the commission, we take trips to some countries when we can to learn, to advocate, but to learn in depth about the circumstance of religious freedom there in a way that you just can't do over the internet. And we had a trip, I was not on it, we go about 2 commissioners at the time on a bipartisan delegation. 2 commissioners went to Turkey, and they asked to see Pastor Brunson, and amazingly, to our total surprise, the Turkish government let them. And they were the first Americans who are not his family and not from the U.S. Embassy to see him in the entire period of his detention. So it's a really bad situation, and we could go on and on about the problems in Turkey. There are very many long-standing religious freedom issues in Turkey, but the increasing authoritarianism in Turkey is concerning on a number of fronts for many, many issues, and certainly the Gulenist followers of Gulen, this religious figure living now, an old man living in Pennsylvania, have borne the brunt of it, I would say. But it's a very widespread and far-reaching problem that could be the subject probably of a whole semester and not just one question. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, good evening. I'm
evening.
Cheryl, and it has been pleasure hearing you, and especially knowing that you have visited Pakistan recently. We are from Pakistan, me and Rufus both. You raised the topic of Mishal Khan. Mishal Khan was one of the Muslims suffering at the hands of Muslims. But probably you would have known of Shama and her husband. Shama, the pregnant woman, was burnt in a
Yes.
brick furnace. And I would like to bring your attention that it's not only Mishal Khan. There are enormous Christian students who are beaten and who have suffered just like Mishal Khan, but they have covered it and they've never let it cover. The girls in Pakistan are, especially the Christian girls, the Christian nunnery schools, because my daughters were in one. They are forced, they are threatened, they are given reasons for not being, especially taking English medium schooling. The boys, however, are held at different incidences and are told to change their religion, or they are forced or threatened. So is there anything under consideration for the Pakistani students, especially under yours? And the
yeah.
Christian students?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, let me agree with you and validate what you're saying. This is just the tip of the iceberg in Pakistan. And going there for just a few days and having meetings all day, every day was barely enough to even scratch the surface. We cover Pakistan every year in our annual report. It comes out by May 1st each year. It's one of the countries, by the way, that we recommend each year for designation as a country of particular concern. That's the kind of the worst category that the State Department doesn't designate. So we've recommended this past year, we recommended 16 countries for the CPC, country of particular concern designation. The State Department agreed with us on 10 of them, designated 10 of them. Pakistan is one where they didn't, and I thought we had it this year. Instead, they put it in a new category called the Special Watch List, which is brand new based on December 2016 legislation. But it's a problem, and they should be a CPC. And of course, I used that example that I did just to illustrate that it wasn't, it's even beyond. I mean, this problem, which affects Christians and Hindus and others in Pakistan, is so deep that the poison has spread throughout, and even Muslims, but not because it's not Christians, of course. I mean, we met with this legal aid society, basically, that helps these young girls who are kidnapped and forced into conversion and marriage. And this crazy story, there's a woman, I mean, we met actually some of the actual young girls themselves, and the center tries to rehabilitate them, and it's really terrible. There was a woman, a Christian mother of 4, who was kidnapped by a man, and for an adult woman, forced to convert and marry him. The Christian husband, the original husband, filed a police report. The police refused to do anything, of course, to follow up on the case. The woman managed to somehow get away and was returned somehow to her actual husband. And the Muslim man filed a police report, filed a complaint that this man was holding his wife. I mean, that's how perverse this gets sometimes. And again, I could spend the whole night telling you. So we are concerned, we are following, we are one small voice, but everybody here can be a voice. And Pakistan, which was 24%, the Pakistani flag, I'll close with this so we can get another, on this question so we can get more. The Pakistani flag is green with a white bar at the end, where the pole would go if we're on a pole. And that, it's about a quarter of the length of the flag, and it's supposed to represent originally the religious minorities, which were 24% of Pakistan at partition. Religious minorities are now 3% of Pakistan about 70 years later. Now, the official story is that, well, at partition, Hindus moved out of Pakistan into India and Muslims out of India into Pakistan, but there's more to the story, and religious minorities are not doing well, but as I said, neither are a majority Muslims, who are also deprived of their religious freedom. I think President Sweeting has a question in the back. I think that's part of it. Yeah. Okay. Try to keep you employed, Jeff.
Yeah.
I have a particular, can I take you back to Andrew Brunson?
Anything.
He's a pastor in the EPC. I'm also ordained in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Are there any alternatives to that deal? I mean, has the U.S. government opened up any other paths for him getting out besides the swap?
Of course, yeah, and the swap is not, I'm sure, not being discussed seriously in official channel, or, yeah, I mentioned the swap because it highlights how egregious it is what Erdogan is doing, but I think there's a lot of other things being considered. Now, they're not listening for the most part, I think. I don't think they're getting good responses. We do know there have been some marginal improvements in his treatment, and he's not being beaten or tortured in prison, thank God, because in some of these countries, that's a regular occurrence, and maybe even in right, Turkish prisons are famous for being bad, I guess, right? But I think they are trying, but there's only so much they can do if nobody's listening. They are working on it. I mean, allegedly, the president has taken this up. I mean, our president has taken this up. And the fact that there's no response on that means Erdogan is really dug in, which is bad news for Pastor Brunson, of course. But let's start with everybody here praying for him. Remember Pastor Brunson in your prayers, and we'll continue to go from there.
Father Andre?
Thank you so much for the wonderful, beautiful presentation. First of all, I like to show my share of a prayer on January 27, the liberation of Auschwitz, and the closing of that chapter and what we can learn from it. And I loved your perspective on religious freedom. But for Dignitatis Humani or Humani Dignitatis, we speak about the religious freedom being a place. So in the future, religions can talk together freely about the true religion. When do you think humanity will be able to talk about the true religion?
Well, if I knew the answer to that question, look, I mean, there's the theological side and then there's the political side. What we need on the political side is to find a way to live together peacefully, not killing each other, which we have done a reasonable job of in the West. But I actually think more than that. I think I teach a course called Politics and Religion, and I'm working on some writing in that area. And one of the things that I bring to the course is the idea. I mean, I don't tell the students what to think one way or the other. They can't figure out my views, and that's part of the fun. But I think as I continue to write about this, is that we actually want more than just a modus vivendi, a way of living together where we're just not killing each other. I think what we want as fellow citizens, let's say in this country, in this society, is to be working together toward a shared, toward a certain. Working together in a shared project is what I'm trying to say. I think we should have civic unity. I think we should feel like there's an American project that we're all building together, and not just going in our separate streams. And that's critical. Now, that's not going to happen by at this stage by trying to get everybody to believe the same thing, but it is to recognize, and this was underlying in what I was saying, and certainly had the conclusion, that there is a common good that we do all share. And we'll all think that part of us are missing the picture because of our different religious beliefs, but there is a common good that we share, and there is a common good that we can work together, work toward together, and I think that's how we want to think about Dignitatis Humanae and everything related to it.
Tim McTavish. See if you can turn it on.
If it doesn't work, you can borrow mine.
Test. Okay. I have a friend who's atheistic in his thinking, and we have conversations, and he would say that religion is not good for society. And I've countered that by saying, well, secular humanism is a religion. Would you agree with that, and is that a valid argument?
Well, it depends what you mean by religion. I mean, secular humanism is certainly a stand-in for religion. I think part of the argument for the place of religion in the public square is that it's arbitrary and unfair to let one group of ideologies come in and then another. I mean, their secular humanism is as devoutly held as perhaps your Christian faith is, if I'm assuming that you're Christian. And so I don't think, in that respect, I don't think it makes sense to say that ideologies, because they're religious, must automatically be excluded from the public conversation in a way that secular ideologies. Now, I do think we need to think about offering rational justifications for the laws with which we want to impose things on other people. But I'm okay with that because I think that the policies that we want can be explained rationally. I think religious believers who don't separate faith and reason especially can bring a very important voice to the conversation. Now, the other thing I wanted to say about that, if I remember before it's too late, I lost it. Your secular humanist friend says secular humanism is also a religion, or you say it's also a religion. Yeah. Oh, right, that's it. Thank you. Right. That. If religion is bad and he concedes that his secular humanism is religion, then I guess he has to be careful. He doesn't concede that. If I were you, I wouldn't concede that religion is bad. I mean, certainly, the problems we see in the world in the name of religion aren't problems with religion. They're problems with human beings. Human beings with power do bad things. Well, human beings in general do bad things. Human beings with power do more bad things, and that just is, which is why we can play these stupid games, go around and on. More people died as a result of the secular ideologies of the 20th century, communism, fascism. Everybody knows this, than were ever killed by. Now, that doesn't make the things that were done in the name of religion any less bad, of course. I'm not minimizing those in any way. But I think it's a silly way to talk about things. Also, and I say this as you've already guessed, I'm an Orthodox Jew. I want America to be a religious Christian country because at least the form that Christianity has taken in America in modern times is a very benign form. I don't mean benign, that's not in a bad way, in a good way, right? And then, of course, you can speak to the social scientists who can tell you all about the amount of charity that's given in America by religious people versus secular people, the amount of volunteer time that's given by religious people versus secular people. Religion is obviously a force for good in our country, and it should be encouraged. And so in that respect, secular humanism is not a religion because it's not doing the same thing. And let me close on your question with this point that I'd like to say. There is no such thing as a multi-generational community of secular humanists. I know it's a new thing too, so we got to give them some time. But what I mean is, in order to have good citizens, we need virtue. This is one of the key lessons of the founders, right? Something the Federalists and Anti-Federalists fiercely agreed upon, right? Then they disagreed about the right way to institute that truth, but fiercely agreed upon that we will not succeed without virtue. Now, where does virtue come from? Well, primarily, historically, religion. Now you say, well, can atheists be a good person? Sure. But the way virtue is transmitted down from one generation to the next is with religion. You don't have secular philosophers who beget secular philosophers who are all virtuous because of the secular philosophy that passed on. And that's because it's not primarily through philosophy, but it's through the lived experience of a community that virtue is inculcated in the young. And it's religions that provide the lived experience of a community in that way. And so I think you've got them. Yeah.
We'll do a few more over here. How about the gentleman and the lady next to him?
Good evening. Brandon Blankenship, thank you for your presentation. It's phenomenal. So I hope my question isn't too naive, but just given your experience and your intellect, I think you would be uniquely qualified to provide some perspective. So for some time, I've been trying to figure out why it is that Jewish people vote consistently Democratic. You look at Pew Research, yes. It says 70+% consistently.
Yes.
And given your own presentation describing those on the left as opposing religious liberty and those on the right, for the most part, defending it,
yeah.
And obviously with the Jewish state of Israel, why is it that Jewish people vote Democrat?
Yeah. So I'm laughing only because I get this question all the time, and it's a very good question. You're asking the right question for sure. Now, I do want to say Jews obviously have a very strong vested interest in religious freedom, but I don't think that's actually part of the equation here because it's only in the most recent years that religious freedom has become a partisan issue. I mean, when the International Religious Freedom Act, here's a stat for you. I know you're talking about domestic religious freedom, but let me say international for a second, and just domestic politics in general. When the International Religious Freedom Act was passed in 1998 and signed into law by President Clinton. It was passed, I believe, unanimously by Congress, at least by the Senate, maybe a few dissenters unanimously. This week, what week is it? Last week, there was a 49-49 split in the Senate on whether to confirm the ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Sam Brownback. Not only did Vice President Pence have to vote to break the tie in the Senate to confirm him, he had to earlier vote to break the tie in the Senate of whether to even give the man a vote. Now, I say that actually without even, you probably got from the tone of my voice where I am on this issue, but I say that actually without even casting, without even expressing a view on the merits one way or the other, but just to imagine how we've gone in 20 years from the international religious freedom. Now, I know there are other political issues at play, of course, but how we've gone from it being a unanimous issue to a sharply divided partisan thing. Okay. So that's why I'm not going to include religious freedom in my answer about the Jews. And it's true, Jews are overwhelmingly liberal Democrats. I mean, you can see this in the exit polls, presidential elections, every time in the cycle. Part of it is the legacy of FDR. When Jews were poor, new immigrants in America in the early 20th century. Social scientists will tell you typically that the number one predictor of how a person votes is how his parents voted. Of course, that's not true. Young people also like to defy their parents in so many ways, I'm told. So my, God bless her, my wife who could not join us is at home back in Indiana, 1 month away from delivering our first child. And she said I have to have some talks with this child about his kicking. So it seems like the baby's already a little bit defiant. But in any case, I had to get a shout out for my wife in the cameras. She's doing the hard work at home. I'm here like on a pleasure trip in beautiful Lakewood, Colorado. So part of it is that. Part of it is you have to keep in mind that of Jews in America, 90% are not Orthodox. So of the major denominations, Orthodox, conservative, and Reform. Conservative is a misleading label in our contemporary politics, but I guess Orthodox is the most traditional. Conservative and Reform are left and moving further left. So 90% of Jews are not Orthodox. And so in many cases, for those people, they're voting on issues like pro-abortion or that sort of thing because that's their primary concern. It's not Israel or something else. If Israel is your most important concern nowadays, people tend to vote more Republican. There's still a lot of holdovers from Israel too. Used to not be a partisan issue. It was a very bipartisan issue in our politics until very recently. So if Israel is your top concern, you're probably, that's why people say, I can't understand how why so many young Orthodox Jews voted for Trump. For example, but if you're voting on Israel, people certainly, Obama did not come across as our most pro-Israel president, and people are reacting to that. And again, I don't even say that to prejudice. I don't even mean to offend anyone in the room who has the opposite view. I'm not presuming we all have the same view on that, right? But he instituted a policy of warming up to Iran, which is the country that has committed itself to getting a nuke so that it can destroy Israel. And he had a famously bad relationship with the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. And so Jews, anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. But the point is that part of it is history, and then part of it is issues. If your religion is social justice, you're probably going to vote Democrat.
We have time for 2 more questions.
That's my fault. I'm so long-winded, so each one takes a long time.
Hi, I'm kind of going back to what you sort of touched on a little bit earlier in your talk, and that's the issue of homosexuality and gay rights and trans rights and all of those sorts of things. So I'm a Christian, and I've actually been told by friends of mine that I need to throw that part of my religion out the door, the part that talks about it being an abomination, and I need to fully embrace gay marriage and the whole LGBTQ movement. And if I don't, I'm a bigot, I'm a racist, I'm a horrible person, and I deserve to fall in a hole and die, basically. So I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
Don't do that.
Well, thank you. But just curious about your perspective on that and how those two pieces of society can coexist in the idea of religious freedom, because my religious freedom to practice what I believe is severely being challenged and damaged in that sense.
Yes. Wow. Okay. Yes. Easy. All right, we're going to finish it out with the softballs. So first of all, let me say that they're giving you bad advice. There's I don't know if he's still in the Diocese of Arlington in Northern Virginia, right outside D.C., but Father Paul Scalia, a son of the late Justice Antonin Scalia, has a very short article that I've used in my when I taught Intro American Politics for a couple semesters at Villanova, and it was called, the title of the article was The Christ Side of History. He says, they keep telling me to be on the right side of history, I'd rather be on the Christ side of history. Because every day we have that choice, right? Whose side do you want to be on? You want to be on the side of history? You want to be on the side of God? So make your choice. Right? And I say that just because I wanted to, but also because part of the answer is that we are in for a fight. We actually do have to win. And that starts, and I know there are different views about this, and really we all agree in the end anyway, there are political fights we have to win. We have to win elections. There are legal fights we have to win. We have to win in the Supreme Court and in Congress as well, but we have to win the culture. Right, so that's up to all of you guys to do the evangelizing. We are not an evangelizing people. And if you're interested in me, my answer is go for the 99% of the world that's pagan, and then when you're done with them, you can come back for me, and we'll talk. But so you've got your work cut out. Did I scandalize anybody? I hope not. I love joking about these things. This is great. I love this community and the work that all of you do. Having said, so we are in for a fight now. Having said that, how can we coexist and live together? And I think that was really the heart of your question. And obviously, the answer to, I don't mean obviously in a context anyway, obviously the answer starts with love. So we do have a lot of right views. We do not have a perfect track record in opposing the other side in the most loving and compassionate way possible. Now, I'm not like way off the deep end in terms of like everything is homophobia and whatever, right? People, my archbishop, as I like to call him in Philadelphia, Archbishop Chaput, says being nice is not a virtue. He said, but speaking the truth in love is a virtue. So we do need to speak the truth. We don't need to shy away from the debates. We can never use. We have to pick and choose our battles, but we can't use cowardice as an excuse for never picking a battle. But having said all of that, we have to make sure that we always speak these truths in love. But we have to keep speaking them, and it's for their own. I mean, this is true for not there's an us and a them, but it's for their own good. Just as all of us, right? The people who truly love us will tell us the hard truths we need to hear. Well, if we truly love them, we will tell them the hard truths that they need to hear as well. But they need to know that we're speaking them in love. And I think that's the hardest part. That means we have to watch our tone. As I gave a talk about this once outside of the classroom setting at Villanova about the campus culture wars and all of that. And I said, social media is generally not the right forum for speaking truth in love. It's not the place where the most loving truth is found in our current society. It's not a good, like someone told me very early in my career, it's very hard to tell tone in an email, or it's got to be careful, which means I think our best approach is, if we really want to live together, it's speaking truth in love one-on-one, speaking to people directly, getting to know people, building a relationship first, and then having the hard conversations. Now, I know we're talking about a society-wide problem, and it's not easy to do that. But somehow that has to be the answer. I could probably ramble on about this more, but in the interest of letting a few more people ask, I'll give you that as just the starter. Incomplete, insufficient, lame answer, but thank you for the question.
Last question. Okay, thank you.
Can we get him on camera? He looks extremely a lot like my brother, and I just want to make sure. that in the official record, I think they actually did it. I don't know.
I'd love to take a picture with you.
So, that's a better idea. Yeah. Put it on social media.
My name is Gerard Abi Hassaf. I come from the Middle East, specifically from Lebanon. Earlier in your speech, you mentioned that people who do not care for religion cannot care for religious freedom. We have more than 220 million Christians persecuted in the world in the 21st century. Every 9 minutes, we have one Christian that is massacred for his faith. Now, the effects of these massacres are more human. First part of the question is that don't you believe Democrats, Republican, liberal, or conservative, you just have to be a human being to relate to these massacres by just seeing them. Second part of the question is, don't you think or do you believe that the Christians and the protectors of the religious freedom in the world, specifically here in the US, are doing enough to save the persecuted Christians of the Middle East who are taking 90% of the heat and the actual persecution?
First answer, yes. Second answer, no. First answer, yes. Of course, we need to relate to this first and foremost on a human level. And that's why I say the commission, we don't defend Christians or Muslims or Jews, right? We defend everyone, right? The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is committed to the right of every person in the world to believe or not believe. People are persecuted in many countries for being atheists as well, unfortunately. Not because I recommend atheism, but because I think you have the right to be free of government coercion in your atheism. So yes, we have to relate on a human level. And that's hard to do because in our hyper media world, there is so much coming at us so fast. It is not humanly possible to feel the compassion we need to feel for everyone around the world at all times. Now, we should work on it. Don't get me wrong. We don't even do a good job of feeling enough compassion, and I say this more to myself than to anyone else, and God forbid not to anybody here. We don't even do good enough job feeling compassion for the people around us, right? The ones we are evolutionarily, biologically programmed to be able to feel compassion for, right? Not the people who we have digital age information about from across the world, which is not to make an excuse for anyone. If we stop and think for a moment on a human level about what is going on around the world, about what it is like for the Rohingya Muslims but outside of North Korea, probably the worst thing to be born into in the world is to be a Rohingya Muslim in Burma. For a Rohingya Muslim in Burma to have to walk barefoot, having nothing to begin with, across barbed wire to try to escape into Bangladesh from the approaching Burmese army who are massacring, maybe not at this moment, but over these past few episodes, Rohingya Muslims. To relate to that on a human level, you have to, and you have to feel the compassion, but it's really hard to do. With a news story every day and our 24-hour news cycle, it's just not possible. Which is why we all need to do our best. It's like what I said before about not taking for granted and not being complacent, which is why we all need to work hard to educate ourselves on religious freedom around the world, on the circumstances, on the suffering, because if we don't, there's simply no way to give it the attention it deserves, and something is big in the news for one day, and then even with ISIS, probably the worst savagery and barbarism maybe the world has ever witnessed, certainly in recent memory, and even that, it can be in the news one day, and then the next day it's whichever idiotic thing out of Hollywood or whatever it is. Now, on the second part, are we doing enough? No. And we've been pushing on that. The commission, again, one small thing, and I don't mean that therefore I can rest on my laurels, but not enough has been done. Iraq went from, to say nothing of Lebanon, which I also don't know the details as well. In 2003, Iraq had 1.3 million, 1.4 million Christians, is it something in that neighborhood? And now it's about 1 million less than that. We are seeing a world historical event. We are seeing, and I hope things that now will move in a better direction, though I'm not overconfident, the elimination of ancient community, right? Things that once lost are never come back. I thought of this, if you remember way back, the Taliban destroyed these 2 giant Buddha statues, and these were, the statues were many centuries old, right? And once those are destroyed, those are artifacts that are lost forever to world history. And I'm not talking in the Middle East about artifacts, right? You're not talking about artifacts. You're talking about human beings and communities. Remember when ISIS advanced, and it was the first time, I'm going to get the stat wrong, it was the first time in 1,600 years that Sunday Mass was not celebrated in Mosul or something like that, right? But individuals and communities. And you know, all this, we're all for finding ways for refugees to be resettled in the right places, in the right ways, at the right time. But we have to remember, we have to be realistic about what we talk about when we talk about refugee resettlement. Refugee resettlement means, and God bless the people who are willing to go home, but resettlement means that the communities there are gone forever. Right? That Christianity in the cradle of civilization, the birthplace of Abraham, gone forever. So we're not doing enough. I think that this administration has been doing some good things. The news about funding and where the funding is going and the way it's going to be directed has been a step in the right direction. There are good people working on this. In fairness to them, it's an enormous problem that would be impossible probably for anybody, any country, any agency to tackle. But I certainly share your pain. And although I grant you probably feel it more acutely than I do, but I certainly want to share your pain and be in solidarity with you in your pain about what is going on there. Oh gosh, that's a sour note. I'm sorry.
That was great. Let's give him another round of applause. Thank you. I want to just discuss a few things. One, I want to make sure that we recognize the fact that religious freedom is a priority here at Colorado Christian University. That's under the leadership of our president, Dr. Donald Sweeting, back here. Let's give him a round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Sweeting. As well as the vice chair of the Board of Trustees here, Tim McTavish. Raise your hand. Let's thank you, Tim, for your leadership here as well. Religious freedom is really a top issue here at CCU, and we just came back from a retreat talking about some of the issues we're going to take on, and religious freedom is one of the very top issues we're going to continue to fight here at CCU. Some ways you can get involved. I want to recognize Father Andre, who's been fighting for religious freedom in the back. Get a chance to connect with Father Andre back there if you can after this. Dr. Mark, can you stick around as well?
Yeah, so
Great.
Go ahead. So number one, I'm happy to stick around and chat as late as people want, but also I did bring a fat stack of cards, my business cards from USCIF. So if anybody wants to follow up with me, even if you don't have time to wait for a question, just want to grab a card or just want to check out our website. Everyone asks, well, what can we do? And the first thing is pray, but the second thing is educate yourself so that you can educate others as well. We'd love everyone's support. Be a voice. Let your elected representatives know that international religious freedom is a priority for you, if it is, but please do feel free to come up and grab a card even if you don't have time to chat after and you want one. Thank you.
Great. And USCIF is a great organization to follow, so get a chance to connect with him. Also, if you're concerned about Christian persecution, Open Doors USA is a great organization to connect with, and Voice of the Martyrs. You can actually start to get involved in the process of raising awareness on the issues of religious persecution. So 2 great organizations in addition to USCIF to follow up with. So friends, as we close, a reminder.